Hello, and welcome to today's webcast in our series Sustainability Watch. We will be talking about green will China's future be implications for international companies. So let me first introduce our panelists to you. So I would like to welcome Anke Schrader. She's the Research Director for the China Center for Economics and Business. And in her personal research focus, she looks at corporate citizenship and sustainability. Anke has lived and worked in China for over 15 years and is the author of numerous publications on China's social and environmental development agenda.
Hello, everybody. Glad to be here tonight.
Welcome. Thank you. And Laurie Milliwalter, he is the lead analyst at the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, and he has worked over the past decade on energy, covering coal consumption, air pollution issues all across Asia. His research covers coal consumption and CO2 trends, sources of air pollution, as well as the overcapacity situation in China's coal-fired power and steel industry. Laurie has also published studies on the health impacts of coal-fired power generation, and he has a degree in economics from Helsinki University and environmental science from the University of Jyväskylä. Welcome, Laurie.
Hello, thank you. Good to be here.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm Uwe Schulte. I'm the leader of the Sustainability Center for the Conference Board. Before we get started, I would like to give you a few heads up on the logistics of this meeting. So you can ask questions, and we encourage you to do so at any point in time via the chat box on the bottom left corner of your screen. If you would like to keep the slides you will be seeing throughout this webcast, you can download the presentation in the middle box there at your own leisure. If you want to look at the screen in full mode, then you click on the 4 arrows on the top there, on the top right-hand corner, and if you want to come back, you click on that symbol again. We will be recording this session, and if you want to share it with colleagues, next week it will be available as a streaming video. Of course, then no more questions can be asked. You can earn professional development credits, CPD and CPE, and for that you click on the request pod or you email us if you haven't registered yet. And then throughout the meeting, you have to click on the 3 pop-ups and you have to stay online for the entire webcast. Again, this only works for the live webcast, of course. This webcast and the whole series is brought to you by the Sustainability Center of the Conference Board, and we thrive to support our member committees to create long-term value by creating a body of knowledge around positive impact and through the look at how sustainability has and can be integrated into the business strategy and business operations. We are guided by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and responsible standards and frameworks for corporations. We are thriving to deliver timely, thought-provoking, and hopefully relevant research. As we are an independent body, a not-for-profit organization, we are absolutely fact-based and try to be as objective as humanly possible. If you want to know more about that, you can always get into contact and visit our website. So, after all this introduction, let's not lose more time and let's get right into it. And I would like to start with Anke. Anke, you've done some research in the field of the Chinese economy recovery package, and you looked at it in the light of its sustainability agenda. Can you share what you found with us?
I'd be glad to do so. If you can go to slide 7, Uwe,
yes,
to get us started.
Yeah.
Obviously, when we started this research, China had not come out with its carbon neutrality pledge, which is what everybody in China in the sustainability space and beyond China really is talking about right now. And so if just for those of you who aren't really aware of this or don't know the details, at the last UN General Assembly, China announced that they would peak carbon emissions before 2030 and would achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. Now, obviously, and Laurie will talk about that in a lot more detail later on, but if we contrast this future statement with what is happening right now in the economic recovery in China, we see that the recovery is really, in a sense, a classic recovery scenario for China, and because it's driven by property development and infrastructure spending. So this is something that has happened in the past before. These are sort of the fallback positions for China when it gets economically difficult. And this is a classic thing that we have seen and that we're seeing right now with the recovery. What this really highlights is that growth pressures for China are very significant, and that efforts so far are centered around mitigating the economic impact from COVID as quickly as possible, and that includes supporting legacy environmentally intensive sectors in China. And they obviously account for a very large share of the current Chinese economy. Uwe, if you go to the next slide, please.
Yep.
Now, like I said, when we started out with this project, we just wanted to look at China's current recovery spending in this COVID period and wanted to assess to what extent we can see if it is investing into green projects. And to do so, we have picked one area that we think is of specific relevance because it looks because these are investments that are focused on infrastructure spending. China, one of the major ways in which China is currently investing into the recovery is through bonds, and part of them are local government special purpose bonds. And what we did is we compared the first half of 2020 with the first half of the previous year, and we categorized projects whether or not they can be viewed as green, so either if they're directly invested into environmental protection or pollution control or ecological restoration, or if projects that are part of the bond issuance are in one way or another explicitly referring to having a purpose to achieve positive environmental impact. So we categorized bonds. We categorized over 1,300 bonds based on this, and then basically compared the pre-COVID with the post-COVID period to see if we can sense any sort of shift within that infrastructure spending, because like I said earlier, infrastructure is a major driver of the recovery, but within that, do we see a shift towards greener projects? Uwe, if you go to the next slide.
Yes.
So what we found is that if we look at it, if we look at the initial numbers, we do see a significant increase in green projects. So if we just look at the first half of 2019 overall, and then compare that with the first half of 2020, we can see that the share of green projects increased from 5% to 21%. So, in first instance, there definitely is an increase in green projects, but a lot of that is simply driven by an increase in investment overall. So because China is utilizing special purpose bonds as a vehicle for the recovery, there's been a large increase in issuance of bonds. There's sort of a 34% jump year on year for the first half of 2020 in issuance of bonds. And so part of that increase is reflective of that. But more importantly, there is a category within the bonds that's called public housing redevelopment, or that we have labeled as such, and that one in 2020 is excluded from bond issuance. And because that category was a large share of last year's bond issuance, a lot of the money had to shift into other categories. So in 2021, there are no bonds that are allocated to public housing redevelopment. So if we take that out of the equation, and we just look at 2019 and 2020 for the other categories, we see that and we look at their share of green investments, then we see that it's really been very, very constant. So we don't really have a shift either way. We don't really have a backtracking. We don't really have a major shift forward into greener projects. Uwe, if you go to the next slide.
Yes.
When we look at the different areas, of how bonds are used, you can tell that except for the sort of very obvious projects around environmental protection, so it's money that directly goes into environmental protection or some sort of natural resource management, there are very few investments right now that can really be definitively categorized as green. You can see here there are some in industrial parks, some in general infrastructure, and some in energy, not much else there. Uwe, if you go to the next slide. And if we then look at the total share of funding being allocated, you can see here on a year-on-year basis, actually for environmental protection, there is a decrease in funding allocation into that area. Uwe, if you go to the next slide. So what we really take away from this is the bottom line is that so far, China's infrastructure stimulus allocation is not really aligned with its public carbon neutrality pledge. So if we look at the current reality in China and how money is spent, how the government is allocating money for recovery, we don't yet see any sort of special allocation towards green infrastructure investment. But having said that, if you go to the next slide, Uwe, I think for anybody who watches this space closely, I think it's pretty much obvious that China's carbon neutrality pledge has to be taken very seriously. So it's not a question of is this going to happen? It's more a question of when exactly will a major shift occur and how will that shift occur, right? And so I thought I put this picture up there because I thought it's quite accurate in the sense that from a business point of view, we don't know, and that's why everybody's wondering about the 14th five-year plan. How dramatic will the changes that necessarily have to take place in order to achieve that pledge, how much of that will be reflected in this five-year plan that's going to come up in next March, right? So when next March, China will roll out its next five-year plan for economic and social development. And so many people are wondering, okay, what in this plan will already be reflective of this shift? Or will it be pushed back to the 2025, 2030 period and beyond, and then there will be an even more radical shift, right? And so this creates a lot of uncertainty right now. And to be fair, this is really uncharted territory, arguably, I would say, for any country in this world, right? And so much of the specifics of the carbon pledge in China still have to be worked out. But obviously, from a business point of view, there's huge uncertainty about how that will play out and what needs to be done. If you go to the next slide, Uwe, I will wrap up with some observations that I have in terms of how that impacts business on the ground in China. So the next 5 years, in my view, or the next 5 to 10 years, will really be crucial to align business strategy and operations. This is sort of a grace period, if you will, for business. So in the near term, like I laid out earlier, initially China's economic recovery will not be from green infrastructure, right? We've sort of seen that, and we are not the only ones who've done a study. We've used special purpose bonds, but other people, including Laurie, they've looked at other areas and they've come to sort of similar conclusions here. But over time, we do believe that there will be an acceleration in investment into green projects. The 14th five-year plan will definitely include some important guideposts, but I don't expect in first instance that it will contain any dramatic turnarounds. What is clear, I think, is that the trend towards stricter pollution control and prevention will continue. So this is something that I think largely the government has been trying really hard to stay on track. And so companies should really prepare for this, especially companies that work in emission-intensive industries. So some of the things that I think we can expect here over the course of the next couple of years is, for example, increased pressure to formulate a decarbonization strategy, increased requirements for emission and pollution control, or any sort of energy efficiency data monitoring and disclosure to local governments, stepped up enforcement of industrial emissions, pollution, and energy standards. We could imagine a scenario where there's increased pressure for public reporting requirements, and just overall increased supervision, auditing, and quota scheme installation. In the medium and long term, I think the pledge really creates major opportunities for companies that are seeking out to contribute positively to the carbon reduction target, and obviously also a strategic opportunity to use green growth or to use sustainability as a core value proposition element within the Chinese market context. And by the same token, obviously, it will ultimately become increasingly more difficult to operate in certain sectors in China, or if strategy is not aligned with the goal, right? So if environmental strategy, emission strategy is not aligned with this goal, it will become increasingly more difficult in China to operate. So I'll pause here, Uwe.
Yeah, Anke, thank you so much. Whilst you were talking, a thought occurred to me. If I'm in a company either already operating in China or planning to operate more in China, one of the things, let me express it in my way and then tell me whether this is the right view or not. In China, if policy changes, it's rapid and it's pretty thorough. And therefore, as a business, in order to be prepared, if I know the direction, it's almost impossible to err on the wrong side, because I know what the direction in general is. And in this case, energy efficiency will be pushed. Carbon emissions will eventually be penalized. So if I prepare myself now, I can't be completely wrong.
No, you cannot. I think it's more about how long will you want to hold out if you aren't prepared to make any significant changes at this point in time. But I think, generally speaking, like I said, for me, there really is no doubt that this shift will happen. And I think the trajectory overall, and there are different scenarios, obviously, of how China can feasibly go about achieving this. And again, Laurie will speak to that in a moment. But ultimately, they all show a similar direction. This sort of, if we believe that this pledge is serious, and I personally believe it is, then there is an inevitability to some of the steps that need to be taken by businesses. And like you said, once China has committed itself to this to this path, and it has, in a very public way in the international community. So there's a lot of pressure now to deliver on this. Also, people are going to be watching this very closely, inside and outside of China. So there's a lot of pressure here to deliver. So I think this is inevitable. So it's more about, do you want to get a head start or not around this?
No, that is very clear. And by the way, companies are facing situations similar in Europe and in the US as well, I guess. But the momentum in the direction seems to be globally going into one direction, rather than maybe 5 or 6 years ago we were pretty confused what's going to happen. So thank you for that. What we would like to do now is to involve our audience. So we have a little poll for you. Just click on the answer that you consider the most appropriate one, and it is basically, when do you think that China will realistically be able to peak its carbon emissions? Before 2025 or wherever you think appropriate? So let's look at the results. We have optimists in our audience. That's good. That's always good. But it seems to be a minority. Okay, thank you very much. So basically what we're seeing is a small proportion of optimists before 2025, and but still quite a few believe that before 2030 this will happen. and the majority is very clearly assuming that it will only happen after 2030. So thank you for that, and that leads me to lead over to Laurie. Laurie, when you look at that, do you share that view of the audience, or how do you see it?
Well, China just committed to peaking before 2030, and the view has been that that's more of a backstop. So a lot of researchers and analysts expect an earlier peak, but it's clear that if we start heading in a direction where emissions keep growing towards 2030, in spite of all the action that we can expect, then there will be a lot stronger administrative measures. I can see that my video is frozen, so I'll just try to do something about that.
That's fine. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so this is encouraging. So please go on.
Thank you. Yeah, so a lot of action this autumn. First, a speech by President Xi at the United Nations General Assembly, quite unexpected. There wasn't really an obligation for him to come up with anything on climate at that point, and so on. He made the big announcement of aiming for carbon neutrality before 2060 and peaking carbon dioxide emissions before 2030, as opposed to the earlier target of around 2030. And then last Saturday at the Climate Ambition Summit, he announced new goals for 2030. So an upgraded CO2 intensity cut, a higher target for non-fossil fuels, a forest sink increased target, and then a target for wind and solar power capacity. So I'm going to look at what each of those mean first, and then talk a bit about what the implementation is going to look like.
Laurie, before you do this, what do you think? What do you think triggered that move to unprovoked make that announcement?
I guess there's two different questions here. One of them is the timing, and the other one is the content of the announcement. And I think you have to think about the content mainly from a domestic perspective. China is obviously in the process of preparing the new five-year plan with targets for 2025. And as we heard from Anke, and as I'm going to describe a lot more, the emissions trends and the trends around economic structure and the economic growth pattern have been very concerning from a climate perspective in the past few years. So growth has very much not only after COVID, but since 2017, steel consumption has grown faster than GDP, and the economy has moved in a very energy-intensive direction. So I think you have to see this announcement in that light. The president, Chairman Xi, of course, knows all of this, and I think this should be viewed above all as a signal towards the domestic planning that is going on. The other aspect is, of course, why now? And I think from an international diplomacy perspective, it's very clear that he wanted to get on the front foot. He didn't want to see the Biden-Harris administration come in, gang up against China with Europe and others, and then be seen as caving to pressure from others, but very much wanted to be proactive and leading.
Thank you.
targets on Saturday. These are okay. My video is back. These aren't as groundbreaking, certainly, as the 2060 target. The old target for CO2 intensity reduction was 60 to 65%, and now the new target is more than 65%. So that's the yellow line here, or downward of the yellow line. But if you simply extend the current trend to 2030, you will get around 68%. So China's already on track to achieve this one. For the non-fossil energy share, China had an earlier target of 20%, and now went up to 25, which is the yellow line here. If you extend the current trend, that would already take you to around 23, 24%. So it's more updating the target to the current trend and then taking it up a notch from there. But there are more significant implications that I'll talk about. And again, similarly, for the target for wind and solar, if you capacity, so as an absolute number, 1,200 gigawatts of solar capacity is, of course, enormous. That's Germany's got 50 gigawatts. So that's 24 times Germany's entire capacity. And but if you simply extend the trend of the past 5 years, keep installing the same amount of wind and solar every year, you will get to 1,100. So it's a small step up from there. But actually, if you look at how much will be needed to meet the 25% target that on the last slide, that's going to mean a lot more. So the very clear implication from these targets is a very significant acceleration in the investment into wind and solar. And so as I mentioned, since 2017, China's seen a rebound in coal consumption, carbon dioxide emissions, and so on, and that has also slowed progress on air quality. And now, after the sharp drop that you can see due to the COVID-19 disruption, after that drop, carbon dioxide emissions in the past, on the third quarter, reached the highest level on record. So that's showing that the trend, in fact, accelerated because of the response of the government to the COVID-19 shock. Just as Anke described, it was very much, or it's been very much going back to the old playbook of building a lot of stuff to make up for the lack of demand from the consumption sector, especially.
When I look at that slide, Laurie, at the moment it is just stating the facts, but we know that capacity is building up in the wrong direction as well, and that's a longer term perspective. Is there any sign that this, based on the announcement, is already changing?
I'm afraid not really. The permitting of new coal-fired power plants has continued. There was, in fact, in May, there was a statement by several ministries that called on provinces to put brakes on adding new coal-fired capacity, but that doesn't look like it's going anywhere. And right now, everyone is waiting for the next 5-year plan to point the reduction. So the two big debates here are one is how fast do you turn the ship around? How fast do you
Laurie, we have some problems with your sound, unfortunately. It seems to be a bandwidth problem. Maybe you could switch off your camera and we'll just listen to you. That would be great.
All right, that's very bizarre, but I'm sorry about that. So my video is off.
Okay, let's try that.
Okay.
But you please go on. I'm sorry to interrupt there.
Yeah. So I think the central point is that right now a 5-year plan is being finalized, and there's a very wide divergence of views of what the climate targets mean for coal capacity. So there are people who say 2060 is very far away. We can still go for an expanded capacity, and then we'll figure out the emission reductions later. We still have almost a decade before we have to peak emissions, and then there are people who point out that continuing to add capacity will just make things vastly more complicated, and the life you already have such an overcapacity problem on the coal power sector, as well as in other industries like steel and cement and so on, that continuing to add capital, add jobs in these industries is just going to make the transition much more abrupt and painful.
Yeah.
So in fact, there has been a pushback on steel capacity, which is also being expanded. The Ministry of Industry and Information Technology just released a document tightening the reins on steel capacity, and I very much expect something similar for coal-fired power plants. So looking at what does this 2060 announcement really mean, and what's its significance? By far the single most important implication is that before this announcement, we already knew that emissions are going to have to peak and decline, but the expectation increasingly was that there would be a very drawn out, slow decline, with emissions staying high for potentially decades after the peak. Whereas, of course, getting to carbon neutrality by 2060 means that you're going to have to target rapid emission cuts after the peak. As I pointed out, the wind and solar market will have to expand to deliver enough clean power, and this is in contrast with the expectation that most stakeholders had before, which was that in the coming years the market would be kept stable. And I already spoke about the implication for coal-fired power plants. So if you think about the road to carbon neutrality, there's a set of low carbon scenarios that in fact underpinned President Xi's announcement, prepared by a program in Tsinghua University, that gives a very good indication of the thinking of how this should be achieved. The pathways include getting to zero carbon on the power sector by 2050 and going negative thereafter to offset emissions from some other sectors. And the overall direction is to electrify everything. So that's transport, electric vehicles, rail, and so on, heating with heat pumps, both building scale and large scale, and industry using, again, heat pumps, direct processes directly driven by electricity and hydrogen as well. And the amount of investment, of course, is enormous, and most of that investment goes in the electricity sector, with obviously investments in fossil fuel production phased out. For the power sector, to be a bit more specific, the annual installations of wind and solar will have to increase 2 to 3-fold. That's because the additions of hydropower are inevitably going to slow in the next years and decades, because most of the capacity has been tapped. And at least in the next 5 years, nuclear growth is actually going to slow down, because not that many reactors are under construction. It could be scaled up again towards 2030, but in this decade, there are limits to how fast you can scale that up. So wind and solar will play a much larger role within the clean energy portfolio, and that also means putting a lot more attention on smart grids, demand response, storage, to accommodate a much larger share of wind and solar in power generation. By 2030, I expect that that will go from 9% last year to 25 to 30% of all the electricity coming from wind and solar by 2030, and half of all electricity coming from emissions-free sources. The big debate, as I alluded to, is how fast to peak and decline, and there is a risk of leaving a lot of the work to the years and decades after 2030. If you look at the recommendations of different organizations and researchers. And then for my last slide, I'll just try to give a flavor of what the implementation and the next steps from the policy side will look like. So the 14th five-year plan, the top level plan will come out in March. Energy planning was originally supposed to be finalized around that same time, but it's likely to take a bit longer to accommodate all of these new targets, which is of course a good thing. But in any case, we should expect the sectoral plans to be released around December 2021, and that's going to include targets for CO2 intensity reduction, total energy consumption, the share of coal, the share of non-fossil energy, potentially the share of non-fossil electricity, and there's also the possibility of setting an absolute cap on CO2 emissions. And the key instrument for driving these targets is looks like it's going to be a carbon dioxide peaking action plan that is being prepared under the Environmental Ministry. And from everything that you can find out about it, it sounds very much like the air pollution action plan that came out in 2013, and that has given very strong powers to the Environmental Ministry in the key control regions. One of the key things was making environmental goals a part of the disciplinary inspections. So essentially, if you don't meet your environmental goals or if you don't implement environmental directives and standards, you get investigated for corruption, which is not a good thing if you're a Chinese cadre. So what we already know is that climate action is getting included into this system. So the same set of tools, the same set of regulatory capacity that was created for air pollution is going to be used to implement the climate goals. And one key feature of the action plan will be the requirement for key cities and key regions to peak earlier. And so for firms operating in the Yangtze River Delta, in the region around Beijing, in the provincial capitals, in Pearl River Delta, this will become real much sooner, because those are the most likely areas where a faster timeline for CO2 peaking will be targeted. And we'll probably also see 2035 emission milestones as a part of the 2035 infrastructure plan, which is a part of a big overall policy package of achieving socialist modernization or a modern socialist economy by 2035. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. That is really very, very interesting, and we see the big challenge ahead here. What I noted in your presentation was the sentence about there's a real determination by the Chinese government to drive electrification of everything, be it mobility or even industrial production, and that might require, of course, the use of hydrogen. So that is something I think that's very interesting for business to see, that it is very clear that in this area a lot of investment will be required. And so if you have products that play in this field, there will be huge opportunities, regardless whether it's going to happen with high speed or lower speed. There will still be big opportunities. Or do I get that wrong?
No, absolutely. That's what I've been repeating a lot. That Europe is targeting carbon neutrality by 2050. We in Finland are targeting 2035. So there are a lot of challenges that we will have to resolve before China faces them, and that's an obvious market opportunity. So, for example, we in Finland have obviously a major need for heating. So any kind of solutions that can be used to heat 500 million people, provide heat for 500 million people in China without CO2 emissions will have an enormous market once they're commercialized, and the same goes for industrial processes, steel, cement, chemical industry, and so on, and certainly anything that has to do with power grids, integration of very high shares of variable renewables, and so on.
Yeah, that is very clear, and thank you for highlighting that. This is now the time for our audience to raise questions and make statements. But before we do so, and please already type your questions in the box on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. But before we get into the questions, we would like to ask you a question, and that's our second poll. Derek, if you could come bring that poll up, because we want to know how you are looking at the at decarbonization for your company. Derek, could you please bring up the poll? Okay, I don't see it. Derek, as I can't see the poll, can you give me the results? Hey, excellent. So the majority is either working on a target or having a target, and so a quarter of our audience at the moment is not considering a carbon target. Anke, when you look at those results, so 75% are engaged in a zero carbon target, but 25% aren't. What is your outtake from that?
I would say that sort of reflects what I see and what I hear when I talk to business and when I talk to our members, that the majority at this point in time are already engaging, either have formulated a target already or are seriously, planning to do so and announce targets in the not too distant future. I would say that from a Chinese point of view, obviously, for MNCs that operate globally and that have a large footprint in China, their carbon goals are often wrapped under their global plans and their global strategies, and that naturally includes China or the China footprint, the China operating environment. From Chinese companies, we have some pledges, but we don't have that many yet. But I do expect that to change. So once, and I think we touched upon that earlier. So once we get more serious and the government puts more emphasis on this, I think they will start to lean quite heavily on the very large Chinese companies and the local champions, as well as the large MNCs in China, and expect them to come out with very clear strategies that support their transition. So I do think overall, globally speaking, that sounds in line with me. I don't expect the same numbers are true for China right now, right? So, but I do think that this will change. For the 25% that aren't considering anything just yet, that will be interesting to see how that will change in just a year or two, or a few years down the road, because like Laurie said, even in Europe, this transition will happen even earlier than in China. But of course, a lot of this will be set in motion very soon, and there will be ramifications for companies that aren't participating and that aren't contributing. I think the two sides, obviously, right? There are industries that are naturally benefiting from a change. So these are clean and green industries, so companies that are directly involved in those sectors, and there are obviously very big opportunities there. But then the other side of that story is obviously just within your own operation. No matter in what industry you are, there is going to be pressure to make sure that you are part of that journey, right? Irrespective if you benefit now directly or not from that shift, you and your operations will be required to tag along on the journey, whether you want it or not.
Yeah, that is an interesting perspective. Thank you. What I would like to ask both of you, if I am a company and I listen to what you've just said, there is a huge uncertainty about at least the time, not the direction, but the time scale of the carbon reduction in China. When I work and consider my strategic options and my investment opportunities, are there signposts that I should be looking at which will indicate to me an acceleration or a slowing down of the process? Laurie, what would you say to me?
Usually things take more time than you hope, and then when they start moving, they move a lot faster and sharper than you expect. So there's a dizzying array of targets that businesses have to meet in China, and local governments have to meet in China, and that often leads to very abrupt action, like we saw with the air pollution action plan, the winter 2017-18, millions of households switched from coal to gas, and tens of thousands of industrial consumers from coal to gas in a matter of months, with not so great results. But that was an example where the government had been saying for years that we are going to eliminate small scale coal burning in this entire region, and people that well, not for such a long time, but they said in 2013 that they're going to do it. And then because in a couple of years for the first couple of years things didn't move, everyone just got lulled into an expectation that this is not going to happen. And then in early 2017, the government was, we told you we're going to do this by the end of 2017, and then it started happening very fast, and industries and unfortunately households that hadn't figured that shift out before were in a very, very bad spot. So I think under the current governance model that has become more top-down and less consensus driven, these kinds of campaigns are very much a feature.
Okay, and Anke, what would you say are signposts that we should be watching for?
Yeah, I agree with Laurie that the top-down approach has definitely intensified, and I think one of the things to look for, the key thing to look for really is how local governments are going to be implementing this. So Laurie touched earlier upon, a national carbon peaking and neutrality action plan, and looking for some of the key localities, how they're going to formulate that and how they are intending to implement and enforce. I think those are the signposts to watch. There are obviously areas, like Laurie said earlier, Pearl River Delta, the whole area around Beijing, Hebei, Tianjin, sort of the usual suspects, but also any of the regions that are heavily reliant on heavy industry, any of those regions that will formulate and implement plans, and what those contain, those would be the things that I would be looking for.
And what about the next 5-year plan? You said you don't expect it to be groundbreaking in that respect, but we might be able to read between the lines?
Well, I think, Laurie already said it earlier. I mean, obviously, just a few days ago, China came out with some more concrete targets here, and we talked about that a little bit, right? We saw the trajectories that those new targets would create. And I think that's sort of, with one or two exceptions, maybe that's sort of in line with what I was thinking. There is going to be somewhat of a tightening or an acceleration, but not in a massive way yet, because given the economic environment right now, it is very difficult to do so, right? And there's already a lot of resistance at the local government level, especially in areas where there is a lot of reliance on traditional industry. These shifts, like anywhere else in the world, take a lot of time, are painful on the employment side, which is something. Employment stability is one of the key indicators for the Chinese government that they track and that they care about. So I think that is pretty much in line with my expectations. So yeah, I would say there are going to be changes or tightening of the targets, but we're not going to see a massive turnaround in the 14th 5-year plan, would be my guess. I could be wrong.
Yeah, Laurie, when I listened to you, one of the elements was that hydrogen will play a bigger role. Is that something to watch? Because, carbon neutral steel or concrete will require the use of hydrogen, won't it?
Yes. In fact, China will be the first country to produce a significant amount of DRI hydrogen steel already next year, according to the current target. So at least on the pilot level, these things are starting to move very fast and faster than the European front runners even. So at least that's something that the industry is is expecting. More broadly, for the steel industry, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the next big thing is simply adjusting to the scale, adjusting the scale, which has been growing into an insane a volume because of the economic policy of the few years. And next year, when the consumption sectors and then more kind of organic economic growth returns, we can expect a lot stronger emphasis on deleveraging and controlling capacity and so on, because those that old playbook won't be needed as much, and the big buzzword that has existed has emerged this month is demand side reform, which should mean shifting the emphasis more to consumption, retail, supporting household incomes, and so on. It's also the natural next step after absolute poverty was declared eliminated this year. So that shift from investment-driven to consumption-driven growth will come back as well, and that should be good news for consumer sectors and bad news for those industries that are dependent on these enormous levels of investment spending. But so if you think about what the leadership absolutely needs to accomplish in the next 5 to 10 years in order to be able to peak emissions and go into that rapid decline, then diversifying the state sector, the state-owned enterprises, is the absolute key thing, because they're not prepared to see state-owned enterprises decline in importance. So in a way, I think there needs to be a reform agenda or a restructuring agenda over this decade to prepare for that rapid reduction in coal consumption, in coal-fired power generation, in steel and cement and construction volumes.
Yeah, that seems to be very much emerging picture. So we heard today that the direction of where China is going is pretty clear. The speed and the exact way of implementation is very much up for grabs at the moment. And we learned from you some areas to watch and make sure that you are alert to those. I think we learned also that once the direction is clear, China is able to speed up processes very rapidly and very drastically. So being prepared for what's to come is obviously good advice. So thank you both, Anke and Laurie, for sharing these insights with us. And no doubt we will continue to watch this scene, and probably the next step is the next party congress and the next 5-year plan. So thank you so much, and for the audience, thank you for listening, and please register for our next webcast, the Sustainability Reporting Trends Amid a Pandemic, and even better, subscribe to the whole series of Sustainability Watch. And now the last thing that remains for me is please give us your feedback on this webcast. It will help us to improve the service to you. And what also remains for me, for those who are looking forward to a few days of holiday, have a very relaxing one and make sure that you stay safe. Until next time, thank you very much.